We've walked now down to the excavation that you're doing this season, Barry, and it's a huge area that you're stripping right inside the hill fort, and you're stripping it down inch by inch. It's what one would describe as a horizontal excavation, isn't it?
Yes, I talked originally about the deep stratigraphy, the layer upon layer which we get against the rampart. Well, you can see we're well away from the rampart here. We're actually in the centre, towards the centre of the hill fort, where there is no overburden at all, no significant overburden of soil, and what there is churned up by agricultural activities. So we simply bring a machine in and we strip the top with a machine down to within a few centimetres of the chalk, and then the last few centimetres are very carefully troweled off to expose the chalk surface which you see in front of us. Now, once we've exposed the chalk surface at this point, it's very easy to see the discolorations of the pits and the post holes which are cut down through it.
Sue Roulard, you're assistant director on the site here, and we've just started to peer into this post hole that you've been working at. A very large piece of wood has been in here at some time.
Yes, that's quite right. We have a very good void in the centre of this post hole, and we have the packing around the edges, which is very clear in this post hole. Sometimes they're not quite so clear as this.
You never found any traces of wood at all?
No, not at all, not on this site.
Mm-hmm. You're obviously lavishing a great deal of care and attention on this hole in the ground. How long does it take to excavate a thing like this?
Well, quite a long time, really, because first of all they're given their grid reference, and then we put a half section across the top of the hole.
Yeah, so you divide it into two?
We divide it into two, yes.
And that's what's happened here. That's why this is only half a hole in front of us.
That's right, it's half a hole. And the first half is taken out with a certain amount of care, and it's a lovely straight half section, as you can see. So we can find out quite a lot from just looking at the section. And then a supervisor will come along and write in detail about the colour of the soil and the texture, both of the packing and of the void in this case. And then he'll ask the draftsman to draw the section, and she'll do it in great detail, drawing at a 1 to 10 scale. And she'll draw nearly every chalk lump and flecks of charcoal, and carefully measure in any flints that might be in the packing or in the void.
Why is it necessary to do that when it's only a load of old packing?
It's a load of old packing, but we can see that at the moment. But later on, when perhaps we've got 2 or 3 other posts which might be similar, the more information you have about it later on in Oxford, the more we can tell about it, and the more we can begin to string them together and find out things in greater detail.
And having got all this information together, what do you do with it then?
Well, it's all deducted from the site notebooks, and it will go onto cards and eventually into the computer, so that things can be recalled very quickly. And it's very useful to have this sort of information on computer.
So you've got half a day at least for this one post hole?
It could well be. If you added everybody's time up, it certainly does take quite a long while.
And how many post holes have you got to get through?
We've got nearly 1,500 on this site this year, so it's going to be pretty hard going.
There's obviously a lot of work to do to find out just how many barns on stilts there were that these post holes represent across the site, Barry Cunliffe. But it's not only above ground that they were storing grain in the Iron Age. It seems that they were digging pits as well, and you've got a lot of those to show too, haven't you?
Yes, all these dark spots are pits, and we estimate at the moment that we've got something like 200 or 300 here. We're not going to dig them all this year, and this is the change of programme that we've had. Perhaps I should explain that for the first 10 years, every area we've excavated, we have excavated totally every feature in it. But we've said that for the next 5-year programme, we're going into a different kind of work. We're stripping, as you see, and excavating all the shallow things, all the post holes and the gullies and the slots and things like that. And we're defining the pits, but we are deliberately excavating only 10% of them. 10% chosen on a purely random basis. And this is for 2 reasons. One is that we want to leave a large sample for posterity to come back to, and they will know exactly where they all are if they want to dig them. And the other is because, it cuts down time, but we want to see how good sampling procedures are. You see, in the first 10 years, we've excavated everything, so we can take a random 10% sample of that and see how it compares with the total, and then see how good the sampling procedure we're using is, what it does tell us, and indeed what it doesn't tell us. So we're testing out sampling procedures as well.
When you do excavate these pits, what do you find in them?
It varies from pit to pit, but most of them contain refuse that is thrown away. They were, after all, a convenient hole to get rid of unwanted things, sometimes bodies, sometimes old joints of meat, kitchen refuse, broken quernstones, anything like that, just thrown away. But you see, what we are doing, and you see over there, they've got a number of blue polythene sacks with sack liners inside. Every single layer in every pit, we take a good substantial half sack of material away to the laboratory. And that provides a very valuable sample of the plants that were growing here for Martin Jones to study.
Martin Jones, you're sitting here in the laboratory with a microscope and a tray of samples there. Now, what is it that you're studying under this microscope?
In this particular sample, you can see clearly we've got fragments of charred wood. That's probably a charred piece of oak there. And slightly smaller, we've got all these snail shells. And I think you can see those ones there quite clearly. But all these little white dots here, they're also microscopic snail shells.
Not much bigger than a pinhead.
And there must be literally thousands of them in this small sample.
Now, as you poke around there, you're doing it with a painting brush, I assume.
That's right.
As you do that, what can you learn from this sample?
Well, I'm looking in this sample particularly for the carbonised plant remains, the carbonised seeds of whatever plants have got in there, which in fact are even small. A lot of them are even smaller than those snail shells, which is why I'm using a microscope.
Now, is that a piece there?
Yes, I think you've got one
tiny
there.
black piece.
Right, and I'll just look at that on the microscope. Oh, that's it there, yeah. Oh yes, now this is a grain of barley. It's, I'm just looking at the back to see what type it is. It is a grain of hulled 6-row barley, a type of barley that is used as a food plant and was the chief kind of barley in use in the Iron Age in southern Britain.
How did it survive so well for all these years?
Well, this one survived because, like the charcoal, it's been burnt and changed totally to carbon. And in that state, it's got fabulous preservation. You can even look at the cells on that grain of barley, or you can look at the fine hairs at the tip of the grain.
Now, you've got another sample over here. What do we learn from that?
This is a rather unusual sample. The sample we've just been looking at is what you'd expect to find if you processed virtually any deposit from Danebury. But this is a particular sample that was extracted from the bottom of one storage pit, where there was clearly a fire at the bottom of the storage pit to burn out the remains of the contents.
But what about all the other stuff that's in there?
Well, if we take it apart, we can see a variety of things. Most of these grains are grains of something called spelt wheat. It's not a wheat that's grown in England these days. In fact, it's hardly grown at all in Europe. But in the Iron Age, it was clearly one of the chief cereals of the country. If we look further, there's one or two grains of barley, just like the barley we saw in the other sample. There's a piece of chaff, by the way. There's chaff in here as well. And, oh, this one's interesting. This is not wheat or barley. It's, as you can see, it's a rather big seed, and it is edible, but it's not a plant we'd think of eating today.
So what's it doing in this grain store?
Well, I think probably the reason that this seed of brome grass is in here was that it was collected to eat. We have a rather narrow-minded approach to plants for eating these days, that if we sow a field of wheat and we harvest just the wheat, and anything else that's in the field, whether it's edible or not, we chuck out. Whereas to the primitive peasant farmer, he probably had a far more economical idea of using a field of crop, in that he wouldn't just harvest his spelt wheat, he'd harvest the brome grass and any other weed that he knew was edible and would bulk up his flour.
You spend a lot of your time doing this sort of scientific analysis. How much further do you think then you're advancing the story of life at Danebury in the Iron Age?
Well, this whole range of biological material that we've been looking at gives us information about the state of the landscape around Danebury, of the pressures on that landscape. It would be impossible to get by just looking at the pits or the pottery. And we can see how well they farm the land and what state the fields were in by looking at these weed species. And then by focusing in on samples such as this one of pure grain we've been looking at, we can tell in particular how they processed a particular harvest, what state it's in, and perhaps get some idea of what they're doing with it, bringing that processed harvest to Danebury Hillfort.
You reckon that there was about 600 years of occupation here at Danebury, Barry Cunliffe, but when do you suppose it reached its zenith? When were times really good up here on this hill fort?
Well, if we use the term good loosely, it was at its peak somewhere in the 2nd century BC. I don't think there's any doubt about that. That was when there was the most going on here. But what we've got to remember all the time is against this economic picture, we've got the human picture, which is infinitely more difficult to grasp at. And one of the beauties of having a very, very large sample to play with, as we have at Danebury, is that we can begin to get hints of the human picture. Now, admittedly, this is a personal theory, but I think it can be substantiated. I think that there was beginning to be, throughout this time, an enormous growth in population. Farmsteads spring up in great number all around. Field systems spread across the landscape. The landscape looks as though it's being packed tight. And I suspect what is happening is that we're gradually getting, in this first millennium BC, Iron Age society forced into a crisis situation. Now, the first obvious sign at Danebury is the massive redefence, which took place somewhere about 300 BC, when the ditches and ramparts were increased in size. But, and we also get towards the end of that period, that enormous entrance which we walked through, with all the feeling of grandeur and power and warfare and attack that there is about it. So society was building up to a peak of tension, and there was no doubt extensive warfare. There are hints of this in the odd bits of documentary evidence we've got as well.
This would be intertribal warfare?
Intertribal warfare, presumably one hill fort against another. And as I said, in a very large sample, we can begin to recognize behavior patterns. In the 4th and 3rd centuries, we find that bodies were actually being dismembered, and dismembered slabs of body were being laid out in special pits. In one, we found an arm cut off at the elbow, just placed in a pit, actually on top of an extended burial. In another, we found a piece of a torso. In another again, last year, we found the pelvis of, I think it's a young man, with the femurs just hacked off, just close to the pelvis, just placed in a pit by itself. Whether they were alive and they were hacked up or whether they were dead, we don't know. But it is the sort of stress symptom that anthropologists have recognized in other societies which were approaching this sort of situation.
There might have been a period when they were under some sort of stress, but would that necessarily lead them to chopping up each other?
Well, under stress conditions, one of the things that does sometimes happen in primitive societies is that one develops what the anthropologists call perversions. One of these perversions is insult cannibalism. This simply means that to really degrade your foe, your fallen enemy, you chop him up and you eat bits of him, not because you're hungry, but this is the best way of insulting him. And it is possible, of course, that our dismembered human bodies are the remains of insult cannibalistic feasts. And then we find towards the end more and more bodies lying around, discarded quite casually in pits. One pit I think produced about 18 men, women and children hacked about and just thrown away in no particular order. Several pits like this, and immediately after, no sign of occupation at all. The pits just silted up naturally. There was no rubbish getting into the pits, nothing. And thereafter the place was simply abandoned until, we must imagine in Tudor times, once a year, the local rural population coming back here on St. Margaret's Day for their fair. And it must have been quite a gay, lively time for a day or a few days. And then the population would go away until the next year. And probably the last real use to which the site was put, was when the famous Danebury stables developed. Just down from the hill fort is the very famous Edwardian Danebury racecourse. And we hear of the local population coming once more up to the hill fort and sitting on the ramparts to get a grandstand view of the races.